Hello and welcome to an introduction to impact. I'm Saskia Walcott, an external consultant working with the National University of Ireland, Galway. This is the first of four recordings, which are recordings of a workshop that I gave, one in May and one in June 2020. I've divided them into four small recordings to make it easy for you to digest and use. This first section, each film I'll aim to make about 10 to 15 minutes long. This first film may be a little bit longer than the rest, and this one is setting out the definition of what impact is. So, just to tell you a little bit about who I am before we go any further. I've worked for 17 years in research communication, which has since, over the last 10 years, become me working more specifically in the arena of research impact. So since 2010, I've been supporting universities, mostly in the UK. I've also done a little bit of work in Europe, but mostly in the UK, to think about what the impact is that comes from their research, help working with research teams to help plan that, but also I've been quite heavily involved in the UK Research Excellence Framework, which has a component to it where universities are required to draft an impact case study that describes the impact that has come from their research. And the final film in these four, the final recording, is going to be looking at what an impact case study is and how you go about putting one together if that's something you have been asked to do for your university. So let's begin by defining what research impact is. There are the standard definitions that you've probably come across. There's the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society and the economy. That's a fairly standard definition, one that the Science Foundation Ireland uses. Also the UK's Research and Innovation body that's in charge of research funding. But also I've seen that a very similar definition also used by the Canadian Research Council as well, so that's fairly universal. The REF definition, the Research Excellence Framework, broadens and expands on that definition above a little bit more by giving a bit more detail as to what it encompasses. So impact is defined as an effect on, a change or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment or quality of life beyond academia. There isn't much mention there of negative impact, as you can see. A negative impact is important, I think, to capture and understand very much from your own learning perspective in terms of the research that you're doing, what hasn't worked well, what hasn't. But as a general rule, it's not something that you're asked to report on, at least not for the REF assessment exercise. So I'm focusing very much on impact here that's had a positive benefit. When impact was first introduced back in sort of 2003, when the UK government started talking about it, it had very much a sort of an economic driver behind it, and it was defined in quite narrow economic terms. That has changed a hell of a lot over the last, well, nearly 2 decades now. There's a much more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of what impact is, and this has been helped by the REF exercise in the UK. The first REF 2014, the nearly 7,000 case studies were submitted, and from that, a study that was done by King's College showed that there were at least 60 different types of impact, if not more, and even that is quite a sort of a broad range of impacts. But you can have impact on many different areas of society and the economy. Your impact might be changing or changing people's understanding or contributing to a public debate. It may be a positive impact on health and well-being of patients, of clinical practice. It could be on government policy. It could be on local government policy. It could be on policies, within public sector organisations. It might be an impact on professional practice, which may be in nursing, medical. It could be legal. In all areas in which professional practice is pertinent. it might have a commercial impact. So it may be that you have created a product or a widget or even a spin-out company that is generating money, has generated jobs, or is helping other companies to expand their product portfolios, or where they sell their products and their sales. There may be a sort of an environmental impact from your research, as well as a positive cultural impact as well. So lots of different ways in which your research can have impact. It's not just about the big bang and big money types of changes that may arise from research. It is far more varied and broad than that. So impact is, as I'm sure you're aware, more than dissemination. So it is beyond the book launch, or the launch event, or the end of project seminar that you hold. It is what happens as a result of your research outputs. And impact is also very much subject to the passage of time. And I think this is important. The very nature of research impact is that it often builds up, and this is what this jigsaw image is about, is that it's a series of building blocks. And I tend to, when I think about impact, it is this sort of series of building blocks that often builds up throughout an individual's research career. But there are staging posts along that, and so there are what I would call sort of, they're sort of minor impacts, or staging post impacts that you get to before you might get to the big impact, which might be saving lives, or changing changing the law, or changing policy. Usually that's subject to the passage of time, and it takes a number of staging posts to get there, which are often made up of of a number of different research projects, of you building your networks. The other important thing about impact is that it is, by its nature, quite unpredictable. You can't always predict what is going to happen, because it can be quite unexpected. You might be out and about thinking that your research is very much about engaging in a certain aspect of society, and that's where the benefit will be. And you might find that, in fact, the research that you have done ends up doing something quite different indeed. So I think, for example, of an academic in Scotland that I have come across. I've not worked with her directly, but I've seen her present, and she talks about the work that she's done looking at initially on marine lice and diseases in fish, and how that research has led her into working with opticians and with people that make contact lens solutions to look at amoebas that are transmitted through water. So not necessarily where she expected to be at all, so it can be quite unexpected. Now this slide shows what you would see as a typical model for impact. The impact is something that is linear. You have your inputs, your activities, your outputs, your outcomes, and then eventually your impact happens. Now, I like this slide, and I do keep using it, even though it is a linear model, which is quite inaccurate, really. It's not really how it will apply to some, but it's quite a sort of STEM-focused model of impact. But what I like about this slide, you'll notice the pink lines that run underneath, and then the arrows below that. And it talks about the planned work, and it indicates the intended results from that. And then the arrows show the areas that can be controlled. So these are the areas which you, as the researcher and the academic, has control over, which is obviously the inputs, the activities, the outputs, publications, etc. And then once the research is out in the world, it is far less under your influence. It's under sort of, it becomes much more sort of indirect. The thing with impact and the change in the way that and the change that impact has brought about is that actually, as researchers, you are now being asked to be far more engaged in this bit that happens, which may not be under your direct influence, which is about the outcomes and eventually, which may lead to impact. So you're being asked to sort of engage more in that sort of under direct influence area. And I think this is an important message, I think, for you to sort of grasp quite early on when we're talking about impact, is that you as the academic are not being asked to make that impact happen. Your job is to aid progress by creating opportunities and to facilitate that impact. The changing of policy, how whether a new sort of practice is taken up, let's say in surgery or in nursing, or whether or not a play is a success or an exhibition is a success, and how people react to that. Those aspects of it are actually outside of your control as the academic, but you are actually being asked to engage more deeply in aiding this progress towards an impact, and in creating opportunities and facilitating networks and opening opportunities that will mean that it is more likely that your research will have a positive impact. So, as I said, the linear model that I showed you in the previous slide isn't a very accurate model of how impact operates in reality. This rather scrawled diagram that I created some time ago is my attempt to sort of show a more realistic version of how impact may occur from your research. I think demonstrates a reality in which there are a number of grants, there are different articles you might write, you may engage in sort of media activity, public engagement, you may start a spin-out company, that may go nowhere, there may be patents filed, etc. All of those elements, some of which will go somewhere, some of which may not, will eventually, may eventually come together and achieve the impact that you're after, but it's going to be the likelihood is it's going to be quite a circuitous journey. And impact can occur throughout the research process. I think that's something else to understand, which is why the film on sort of monitoring and evaluation, which I think is the third recording in this, is worth watching, because you need to be capturing and thinking about impact throughout the process, because it can happen at all stages. And this is particularly true when you're talking about impact in the social sciences and in the arts and humanities. Those sort of research activities, which tend to be very much about engaging with external organizations, community groups, or individuals or companies, the likelihood is that the very sort of active engagement begins a process of generating a change, which hopefully is positive, amongst the sort of the stakeholders that you're working with. So in reality, impact can occur throughout the research process, and that's really worth remembering, because if you're doing or thinking about impact just at the end, you're not doing impact, you're just doing dissemination. This is another slide on impact in the arts and humanities, and what I'm trying to demonstrate with this slide is that, and originally this was a slide about public engagement, but in the arts and humanities I'm often asked about public engagement and what does that mean in relation to impact. Well, I think it's important to note that the activity to disseminate and engage the public with the research is not the impact. That is the output that you have created. The impact is the evidence of an effect on the audience or public, that they may be doing something different. Now, you will no doubt attempt to capture that in some sort of feedback after an event, so you have that impact that is very, very sort of what I call point of delivery impact with public engagement, which is can often be, which is mostly always very positive. Really strong impact of change when it comes to public engagement is actually being able to go back to groups that you have worked with, maybe 6 months down the line, and to see if that change is sustained. Now, I'm not suggesting that when you're doing Pint of Science, or an event in a theatre or something of that nature, or at a science fair, that you collect everybody's addresses and ask permission to go back to them 6 months down the line. That's probably unrealistic, but just be aware that public engagement activities, as hugely beneficial as they are, I think both for you as in building skills that are required for engagement, in helping you in some respects really sort of understand your own research on a deeper level, has its challenges in terms of pathway to impact or vehicles to impact. So, to reiterate what I said earlier, impact is not something you have right at the end. It is more an attitude of mind that you have throughout the research process. And I think over the years I have come to this deeper view of impact. You know, everything in all the slides that I've given you already are all very accurate. It describes what impact is. But the academics that I have worked with, the researchers that I've worked with that are really engaged in impact, that are successful in terms of um, taking their research out to groups, communities, beneficiaries that can use it, is that they tend to begin um, with a slightly different mindset. So, you know, impact for me is about the relationship you build. It is the dialogue that you as researchers will have, where you ask research questions that are slightly different from the ones that you would have asked if you hadn't linked with others. So that's very much about having those networks and having those conversations. But importantly, it's this idea of an attitude of mind that you have throughout the research process. Now, those aren't actually my words. I've stolen that as a quote from a research paper that was done on it was a piece of research that was actually conducted with the panel members from the first REF 2014 before they actually went through the exercise. And when I came across this, I loved it. I thought, this is it. You have managed to capture my own philosophy on what impact is based on my experience of working with others. So I think, you know, if there's one thing I'd love you to take away from this film, is this idea that, you know, your impact is there at the beginning. You know, it's about an attitude of mind, and it's something you think about at the beginning, and it affects the questions you ask. It affects the relationships that you have in a positive way, I would hope. So, what does impact mean for you as researchers? Well, I think first of all, it adds a new dimension to research that requires different considerations and skills from the very start. And this begins, you know, it begins at the grant application process. And it requires a degree of planning. I think the Irish funding councils do ask for dissemination plans and knowledge exchange plans. I think the difference, the slight difference with the impact plan is that you're not just putting on a sort of a general, yeah, we will engage with so-and-so and do this and this. And I say this because when I worked at the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, I was head of communications there, and I dealt with a lot of knowledge exchange and communications plans, as they were then known, that were submitted by grant holders. And sometimes they were very much a bit of a tick box exercise with the sort of things they were meant to do. The difference with an impact plan is that you need to put a bit of thought into who your stakeholders are at the very start, and you need to be thinking about the tailoring your activity to fit the needs of those stakeholders. And ideally, you need to be engaging with those stakeholders and demonstrating that as part of the grant application process. I think the other difference in terms of this sort of what we call in the UK the impact agenda is that it means for academics the end of the funding is not the end of the impact journey. And this can be a real challenge because, you know, you work from research grant to research grant. You know, you finish one research grant, you get your outputs out, and then you're on to the next one. Part of the challenge of impact is thinking, and going back to that initial slide where I've got the sort of series of building blocks, is to think in a slightly more long-term way. Because actually, a lot of the impact activities may come once the funding is done, once you have your sort of findings to disseminate. You may have the stakeholder groups that you've engaged with, but then once you have findings, which you may have turned into sort of a short film or be communicating via a series of infographics, those are all materials that you can get out on social media, that you can use as part of presentations, you can use to engage people, to sort of continue that impact journey sort of as you then progress onto your next research grant. The other important thing about what it means for you as researchers is that I think impact demands a collaborative approach. Both internally, in terms of working maybe more with colleagues, thinking about you know, multidisciplinary research approaches, but also externally, building networks and relationships. And those external networks and getting yourself from behind your you know, your desk or your you know, your lab bench is really important in terms of building networks and relationships. And I know that can be intimidating, but the collaborative approach that impact asks for is a seam that runs right through it, from the very sort of start of thinking about the grant application through the research process and beyond. There are, of course, challenges. I think I've hinted at a few of those on the last slides. I think it can be quite daunting as a researcher to be asked to go out and to think about who might be interested in research. You may have no idea who that is, in what way they're interested, or even how to contact them. And that's where your research support office can help you, and that's what they're there to do. But also your colleagues in your departments, in your teams that you're working with. You know, it's really good to have I always recommend having a sort of a quick get together, a brainstorm, and sort of teasing ideas out of other people as well. When you're starting that process of thinking about who do I want to engage with, who might be interested in my research. There are practicalities around engagement. Often one that comes up I find frequently is around sort of language, and that can be not just talking to people outside of academia or businesses or public sector organisations, but even talking across disciplines. So language is something that is often a hurdle that you will have to get over. And you know, part of that is reading the publications of the sector that you're interested in, attending their conferences, understanding how they're often talking about very similar ideas to yourself, or very similar concepts, but using different language. Compatibility of timeframes can also be an issue. Again, you know, and I'm sure you're aware of this, you get that disparity between what we call sort of academic time and the time restraints of private or commercial organisations and even public sector organisations, and there can be a difference in understanding there. But there are also, of course, opportunities for engagement. Brings opportunities. It's not just about challenges. And this is, again, very much based on my own kind of experience. I did a master's a few years back, and as part of that, I did a small research project with some arts and humanities researchers to understand, because arts and humanities in the UK anyway, when Impact first came out, were probably the community that were most vocal about their resistance and disapproval of it. And so I spoke to a small selection of arts and humanities scholars to understand how Impact had affected or changed their research activity or how they approached their research. And perhaps unexpectedly, I got a lot of positivity back. So, you know, one of the things that came out of that was that people were given opportunities to build new and very different networks to the ones that they'd had before. And that led to new research ideas. It also led to alternative funding streams for them. So they were getting, they had different sources of funding. It helped develop their own skills personally. Obviously, it speeded up knowledge translation. And actually, you know, it also gave them as individuals a greater sense of fulfillment in their role as well, which may sound a little bit sort of apple pie, but I don't think that is to be, you know, just dismissed as, you know, cynically dismissed. I think what I've witnessed is that academics who really get something out of engagement, who are really enjoying building those networks, thinking about their research differently, are hugely motivated and enthused by that scenario. So for this, the first recording on defining impact, a few takeaways for you. I think it's important to remember that impact takes time to develop. It's not something that's going to happen after your first research grant. Your role as the academic researcher is to facilitate that impact, to create the opportunities. That's what you're being asked to do. You can't make that impact happen. And finally, you know, impact is a state of mind. It is the way that you approach your thinking about your research. It is how you engage with the stakeholder groups or the potential beneficiaries. It's the kind of questions you ask them. It's the level of interest you have in what their problems are and how your research might help to solve those. So it is very much a sort of a state of mind in how you approach it. Okay, that's the end of the first recording. I hope you have found that engaging, and I will have 3 more of these for you.